The scent of motor oil hits me every morning like a warm handshake, familiar and grounding as I step into Ridge Autoworks, the shop I've poured 15 years of my life into. It's not just a garage, it's my sanctuary, where engines hum their secrets and I piece them back together, bolt by bolt. I'm not just a mechanic here. I'm the guy who knows every piston's pulse, who built this place from a rundown shed into a business that keeps half the town's cars running. My hands, calloused and stained, move with a rhythm that feels like art, tightening a nut or sliding a wrench like it's second nature. But to my wife's family, I'm none of that. To them, I'm just the guy in greasy overalls, the one who doesn't fit their polished world. That morning, I was elbow deep in a sedan's engine, the kind of job that makes you lose track of time, when I heard the door chime. I wiped my hands on a rag, expecting a customer, but it was her, my wife, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes avoiding mine as she stood there, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. I knew something was wrong before she even opened her mouth. "It's about my sister's wedding," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. She doesn't want you there." I leaned against the workbench, the rag still in my hand, and let the words sink in. Her sister, the family's golden child, was getting married in a few weeks, and I'd just been banned. "She thinks you'd embarrass them," she added, her words stumbling out like she was trying to soften a punch. "You know how she is." I nodded, slow and deliberate, because what else could I do? It wasn't the first time her family had looked down their noses at me. For years, I'd been the outsider at their fancy dinners, the one they tolerated because I was married to their daughter. I could still picture her father's tight smile when I'd talk about my work, or her mother's quick subject changes when I mentioned the shop. They didn't get it, didn't want to. To them, I was a smudge on their perfect family portrait, and now her sister had drawn a line in the sand. I looked at my wife, waiting for her to say something else, to stand up for me, but she just stared at the floor, her silence louder than any words. I tossed the rag onto the bench and turned back to the engine. "Guess I'll stay home then," I said, keeping my voice steady, though inside, something twisted, a mix of hurt and anger I didn't want to let spill out. She lingered for a moment, like she might say more, but then the door chimed again, and she was gone. I stood there, the hum of the shop filling the quiet, and tried to focus on the engine in front of me. The sedan needed a new timing belt, a straightforward fix, but my hands weren't as steady as usual. I kept replaying her words, the way she'd said embarrass, like it was a fact, not an opinion. I'd always known her family thought I wasn't good enough, but hearing it laid bare like that, from my own wife's mouth, stung deeper than I wanted to admit. I tightened a bolt, maybe a little harder than necessary, and told myself to let it go. This wasn't new. I'd been dealing with their judgment since the day we got married, when her father pulled me aside and asked if I was sure about taking on his daughter, like I was some charity case she'd picked up. Back then, I'd laughed it off, told him I loved her, and that was enough. But now, standing in my shop with her sister's wedding band hanging over me, I wasn't so sure it was enough anymore. I glanced at the clock, barely noon, but the day already felt heavy. A customer's truck was waiting in the next bay, a beast with a busted transmission, and I had a stack of invoices to sort through before closing. Work was my refuge, always had been. When life got messy, I could come here, lose myself in the clank of metal and the logic of machines. Unlike people, engines didn't judge. They just needed someone to understand them, to put the pieces back right. I grabbed a wrench and got back to the sedan, trying to push the morning's conversation out of my head. But it clung to me like the faint ache in my knuckles after a long day. I thought about her sister, always the center of attention, always chasing something bigger: fame, status, whatever would make her shine brighter than the rest of us. She'd never liked me, not really. I was too quiet, too rough around the edges for her world of glittering parties and important friends. And now she'd decided I wasn't even worth a seat at her big day. I wondered what she'd told her fiancé, what kind of picture she'd painted of me to justify keeping me away. Probably something about how I'd show up with oil on my shirt, embarrassing her in front of her high society guests. The thought almost made me laugh, almost. I learned a long time ago to let their assumptions roll off me, but this one stuck. Maybe because it wasn't just her sister this time. My wife's silence had said more than her sister's words ever could. I finished the timing belt and stepped back, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. The shop was quiet now, just the hum of the overhead fan and the occasional clatter of tools from my assistant in the back. I walked over to the sink, scrubbing my hands with industrial soap, watching the black streak swirl down the drain. I could still fix things: cars, at least. People were trickier, and families trickiest of all. I dried my hands and glanced at the photo on my desk, a faded shot of me and my wife from our own wedding day. We were young, grinning like the world was ours. Back then, I thought love could bridge any gap, even the one between my world and hers. Now, I wasn't so sure. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts, a customer checking on their pickup. I answered, my voice calm, professional, the way I always sounded here. This was my domain, where I was in control, where no one could ban me or make me feel small. But as I hung up, I knew the day's sting wouldn't fade so easily. I'd go home tonight, sit across from my wife at dinner, and we'd both pretend nothing had changed. But something had a crack in the foundation, small but real. I picked up my wrench again, ready for the next job, because that's what I did. I fixed things, even when they felt broken beyond repair. I sat in the kitchen that evening, the clink of my fork against the plate louder than it should have been, because neither of us was talking. My wife sat across from me, picking at her food, her eyes darting to her phone every few seconds like it might save her from the silence. I took a bite of chicken, chewing slowly, trying to act like this was just another dinner, but her sister's wedding band hung between us like a storm cloud. She'd come home from the shop that morning and dropped the news, then left me to stew in it all day. Now, here we were, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I set my fork down, the sound sharp in the quiet, and looked at her. You gonna say anything about it? I asked, keeping my voice even, though I could feel the edge creeping in. She sighed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and finally met my eyes. It's not me, okay? It's my sister. She's marrying this big shot guy, and she's got it in her head that everything has to be perfect. She doesn't think you'd fit in. Fit in. The words landed like a slap, not because they were new, but because they came from her mouth. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, and let that sink in. Her sister's fiancé was some manufacturing tycoon, the kind of guy who probably had more money than I'd see in a lifetime, and her family was bending over backward to impress him and his crowd. Government types, tech hotshots, she'd rattled off the guest list like it was a royal court, and I was the peasant who'd ruined the vibe. So, what's the plan? I said, keeping my tone calm, though my chest tightened. I just stay home, act like it never happened. She frowned, like I was making this harder than it needed to be. I don't know. I tried talking to her, but you know how she gets. She's got this vision for the wedding, and she's not budging. I nodded, staring at the table, the wood grain blurring as I tried to keep my cool. I'd spent years playing the quiet husband, biting my tongue when her family made their little digs about my job, my clothes, the way I didn't care for their cocktail parties. I'd done it for her, because I loved her, because I thought we were a team. But now, sitting here, I wasn't sure whose side she was on. I stood, carrying my plate to the sink, the scrape of ceramic against the counter louder than I meant it to be. I'm not gonna beg to be at a wedding I'm not wanted at, I said, my back to her. But you could have stood up for me. She didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice was small. I didn't want to fight with her. It's her day. I turned on the faucet, letting the water drown out whatever else she might have said. Her day. Sure. But what about ours? What about the promises we'd made to each other, the ones that were supposed to mean something? I scrubbed the plate harder than necessary, watching the suds swirl down the drain, and tried to focus on that instead of the ache building inside me. The truth was, I didn't care about her sister's wedding, not really. I'd have gone, sat in the back, clapped when I was supposed to, and called it a day. But being told I wasn't good enough, that I'd somehow taint their perfect picture, that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I dried my hands and headed to the garage, my refuge when the house felt too small. The air was cooler out here, thick with the smell of oil and metal, and I flicked on the light, letting it wash over my workbench. Tools lined the walls, each one in its place, each one dependable in a way people sometimes weren't. I picked up a socket wrench, turning it over in my hand, the weight of it grounding me. I didn't need her family's approval. I'd built a life without it. Ridge Auto Works was mine, a business I'd grown from nothing, and it paid the bills, kept the lights on. But there was something else, something her family didn't know, something even she didn't fully grasp. My consulting firm, CR Dynamics, wasn't just a side gig. It was a powerhouse in its own right, fixing broken companies the way I fixed broken cars. A few years back, I'd gotten a call from a manufacturing firm on the brink of collapse, massive debt, failing systems, the works. I'd spent months redesigning their production lines, streamlining their operations, and pulling them back from the edge. They tripled their output in under a year, and the board called it a miracle. But I didn't take the spotlight. I let my co-director, a sharp woman who loved the stage, handled the press, the meetings, all the public stuff. I liked working in the shadows, where the real fixes happened. What nobody knew, not her sister, not her parents, not even my wife, was that the company I'd saved was her sister's fiancé's. His empire, the one her family was so desperate to impress, would have been dust if I hadn't stepped in. I set the wrench down, the irony hitting me like a punch. They thought I was just a guy with grease under his nails, but I'd held their golden boy's future in my hands and never said a word. Part of me wanted to tell her, to march back into the kitchen and lay it all out, see the look on her face when she realized who I really was. But I didn't. Not yet. That kind of truth needed the right moment, and this wasn't it. I walked over to the old Mustang I'd been restoring, a side project that kept me sane when the world got loud. Its curves gleamed under the fluorescent light, half-finished but already beautiful. I ran my hand along the hood, feeling the smooth metal, and thought about what I'd built, not just cars, but a life. I'd never needed her family's respect to know my worth, but it still stung that she hadn't fought for me. I heard the back door creak open, and she stepped into the garage, her silhouette framed in the doorway. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer now, like she was trying to bridge the gap. I didn't turn around, just kept my hand on the Mustang. "I'm listening," I said, because I was, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. She took a step closer, her shoes scuffing the concrete. "I hate this. I don't want you to feel like I'm choosing them over you." I finally looked at her, her face half-lit in the dim glow, and saw the guilt in her eyes. But guilt wasn't enough, not tonight. "Then don't," I said simply. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she didn't know how to fix this. And maybe she couldn't. I turned back to the car, picking up a rag and wiping down the fender, because that's what I did when things got messy. I kept working. She stood there for a moment longer, then left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. I stayed in the garage, the hum of the world outside fading, and let the weight of the day settle. I wasn't invisible, not to the people who mattered, but right now, I felt like I was standing in a room full of shadows, waiting for someone to see me. I was wiping down my workbench at the shop, the morning light slanting through the windows, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I figured it was a customer, maybe someone griping about their bill, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. It was him, the groom, the man my wife's sister was marrying. I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering over the answer button, wondering why he'd be calling me. We'd never met, never even spoken, and as far as I knew, he didn't have a clue who I was. I took a breath and answered, keeping my voice steady. "Hello." His voice came through, warm and direct, like we were old friends. "Hey, is this Chris?" The guy from CR Dynamics. My grip tightened on the phone. He didn't know me as the guy married to his fiancé's sister, didn't even know my last name, just the engineer who'd pulled his company out of the fire. I leaned against the workbench, the cool metal grounding me, and said, "Yeah, that's me." He laughed, a big, relieved sound. "Man, I've been trying to track you down for weeks. I owe you big time. That overhaul you did for us, it's still paying off. We're rolling out the next phase of upgrades, and my board's dying to meet the brain behind it. You got any plans tomorrow?" Tomorrow. The day of the wedding I'd been banned from. I glanced around the shop, at the tools lined up neat on the wall, the half-fixed pickup in the bay, and felt a strange calm settle over me. "Tomorrow's wide open," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but close enough. He didn't miss a beat. "Perfect. I'm tying the knot, and we're having a big event. Lots of industry folks will be there, my people, some investors. I'd love to introduce you, let them see the guy who saved us." "You in?" I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. He was inviting me to his wedding, not as family, not as the guy his fiancée had written off, but as the engineer he respected. I could have told him right then who I was, that I was supposed to be at his wedding anyway, or that I'd been told to stay away. But I didn't. Something in me wanted to see this play out, to step into that room on my own terms. "I'll be there," I said, my voice calm, though my pulse was kicking up. He thanked me, rattling off details about the venue, but I barely heard him. When I hung up, the shop felt quieter than usual, like the world was holding its breath. I slipped the phone back in my pocket and picked up a wrench, turning it over in my hand, the metal cool against my palm. I'd spent years staying out of the spotlight, letting my work speak for itself. CR Dynamics wasn't just a side hustle, it was a machine I'd built from the ground up, fixing companies the way I fixed engines. When his company came to us, it was bleeding money, their production lines a mess, their morale in the gutter. I'd spent nights poring over their numbers, redesigning their systems, finding the weak spots and shoring them up. By the time we were done, they were running smoother than ever, and he'd called me a genius in a boardroom I never stepped foot in. But I'd kept my name off the press releases, let my co-director handle the handshakes and headlines. I liked it that way, working in the background, where the real fixes happened. Now, though, the background wasn't an option. I set the wrench down and walked over to the coffee pot in the corner, pouring myself a cup. The steam curled up, and I took a sip, letting the bitterness wake me up. I thought about my wife, about how she'd react if she knew he'd called. She'd probably beg me not to go, tell me it'd make a mess, stir up drama with her sister. And maybe it would. But this wasn't about her or her family anymore. This was about me, about the work I'd done, the respect I'd earned without ever asking for it. I glanced at the clock, barely 10, plenty of time to finish the pickup before lunch. I set the coffee down and got to work, sliding under the truck, the familiar creak of the creeper easing me into focus. The transmission was a tangle of bad seals and worn gears, but I could fix it, same as I'd fixed his company, same as I'd fixed 100 other things. That's what I did. I saw what was broken and made it right. But as I tightened a bolt, my mind kept drifting back to his call. He'd sounded genuine, like he meant every word about wanting me there. I wondered what he'd say when he realized I wasn't just some engineer, but the guy his fiancé had banned for being too rough around the edges. Would he laugh it off? Get mad? I didn't know, but I was done hiding who I was. I finished the truck and rolled out from under it, wiping my hands on a rag. The shop was humming now, my assistant banging away in the back, the radio muttering some old country tune. I walked over to my desk, a cluttered mess of invoices and parts catalogs, and sat down, staring at the photo of me and my wife. It was from a camping trip a few years back, both of us grinning by a fire, her head on my shoulder. I'd thought we were solid then, that we could handle anything. But now, with her sister's wedding looming, I wasn't so sure. She hadn't fought for me when her family pushed me out, hadn't even tried to change their minds. That stung more than the ban itself. I leaned back in the chair, the springs creaking under me, and thought about tomorrow. I could stay home, keep the peace, let her family keep their perfect little bubble. Or I could show up, not to make a scene, but to stand in the truth of who I was. I wasn't just a mechanic, not just the guy in greasy overalls they loved to look down on. I was the man who'd saved an empire, who'd built a life from nothing, who'd earned a seat at any table I chose. I stood, grabbing my jacket from the hook by the door. The shop could wait for a few hours. I needed to clear my head. I stepped outside, the air crisp, the street quiet except for the occasional car rolling by. I started walking, no real destination, just moving to keep the thoughts from piling up. Tomorrow wasn't about crashing a wedding or settling scores. It was about taking back my name, about showing up as the man I'd always been, whether her family saw it or not. I didn't need their approval, but I was done letting them define me. By the time I got back to the shop, the sun was higher, the day stretching out ahead. I had work to do, parts to order, customers to call. But as I stepped inside, the phone call still echoed in my head, his voice clear as day. You in? Yeah, I was in. Not to prove them wrong, but to remind myself who I'd been all along. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot on my tie, the navy suit hugging my shoulders just right. I'd bought it a year ago for a client meeting I never ended up attending, and it had sat in the closet ever since, waiting for a moment like this. No grease stains, no worn cuffs, just clean lines and a quiet kind of strength. I ran a hand through my hair, smoothing it down, and caught my reflection staring back. I didn't look like the guy my wife's sister had banned, the one she thought would drag oil tracks across her perfect day. I looked like someone who belonged, and for the first time in a while, I felt it too. Downstairs, my wife was pacing the kitchen, her coffee untouched on the counter. She'd been like this since I told her about the call from her sister's fiancé, about his invitation to the wedding. Please, she said, her voice tight, don't go. You know how she'll react. She'll lose it, and it'll ruin everything. I slipped my wallet into my pocket, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. Ruin what? I asked, not looking at her. Her big day? Or the story she's been telling everyone about me? She stopped pacing, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. It's not about you. It's about keeping the peace. You show up, and she'll make a scene. You want that. I turned to face her, leaning against the doorframe. Her eyes were pleading, but I saw something else there too, fear, maybe, that her family's house of cards was about to fall. Nobody cared about peace when they told me to stay away, I said, my voice calm but firm. I'm not going to make trouble. I'm going because I was asked. That's it. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she'd run out of arguments. I didn't wait for her to find more. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, the weight of her silence following me out. Outside, a black sedan was waiting in the driveway, sent by my co-director at CR Dynamics. She'd insisted on it when I told her about the invitation, said it was only right for the guy who'd saved an empire to show up in style. I slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my suit, and gave the driver a nod. As we pulled away, I watched my house shrink in the side mirror, wondering what I'd come home to tonight. The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts run wild. I didn't want revenge, not the petty kind. Anyway, I wasn't going to storm in, throw my weight around, or shout about how they'd misjudged me. That wasn't my style. But I was done hiding, done letting her family paint me as less than I was. I built 2 businesses from nothing: Ridge Autoworks, where I fixed cars with my own hands, and CR Dynamics, where I fixed companies most people wrote off as dead. Her sister's fiancé knew that, even if she didn't. He'd called me himself, asked me to be there, not as some plus one, but as the man whose work had saved his company. That meant something, and I wasn't about to turn it down just to spare her feelings. The sedan wound through the city, past strip malls and quiet neighborhoods, until the skyline gave way to rolling hills. The venue was out here somewhere, a fancy estate turned wedding palace, according to the details he'd sent. I shifted in my seat, checking my phone out of habit, but there was nothing, no texts, no missed calls. My wife hadn't tried to stop me again, hadn't even wished me luck. I didn't know if that made me angry or just tired. I tucked the phone away and looked out the window, the world blurring past. I thought about the years I'd spent keeping my head down, letting her family's comments slide because I didn't want to rock the boat. The time her father asked if I'd ever considered something more stable than the shop, like turning wrenches was a kid's hobby. Or the way her mother would steer conversations away from my work, like it wasn't worth mentioning. I'd let it go because I loved my wife, because I thought we were stronger than their opinions. But now, with her sister's ban and my wife's silence, I wasn't so sure what we were anymore. The car slowed, pulling into a long driveway lined with manicured trees. The estate loomed ahead, all stone and glass, like something out of a magazine. Cars were already parked in neat rows, sleek sedans, a few limos, the kind of vehicles that screamed money. I thanked the driver and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The air was warm, laced with the scent of cut grass and flowers, and I could hear music drifting from somewhere inside, soft and elegant. I straightened my jacket, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. This wasn't about proving them wrong, I told myself again, though part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. It was about showing up as myself, not the version her family had decided I was. I started toward the entrance, my step steady, when a security guard in a black suit stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Name?" he asked, his tone clipped, like he was used to turning people away. I gave it to him, watching his eyes flick to the tablet in his hand. He frowned, scrolling for a moment, then looked up. "You're not on the list." I nodded, expecting this. "Check the groom's list," I said, keeping my voice even. He invited me personally. The guard hesitated, then tapped the screen a few more times. His frown deepened, but he stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said, almost reluctantly. I gave him a nod and walked past, feeling his eyes on my back. The courtyard opened up ahead, filled with people in suits and dresses, glasses of champagne catching the sunlight. I scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face, but I didn't see my wife or her sister. What I did see was a group of men near the fountain, laughing, one of them gesturing wildly as he told a story. And there, in the middle, was the groom himself, his smile bright, his posture easy. I took a breath, my heart steady but loud in my chest. This was it, the moment I stepped out of the shadows, not for her family, but for me. I wasn't here to beg for a seat at their table. I was here because I'd earned one, and nobody, not her sister or anyone else, could take that away. I started across the courtyard, the music fading into the background, my focus narrowing to the man who'd called me here. Whatever happened next, I was ready not to fight, but to stand my ground, to let the truth do the talking. I stepped into the courtyard, the murmur of the crowd wrapping around me like a low hum, and felt the weight of 100 eyes I couldn't see. The estate was a spectacle, stone arches draped in white flowers, tables gleaming with crystal, a cathedral-turned wedding venue that screamed money and ambition. I adjusted my tie, the navy suit sharp against my skin, and kept my step steady, like I belonged here, because I did. Not because of my wife's family, but because of the work I'd done, the kind that had caught the attention of the man I was here to meet. The air was thick with perfume and champagne fizz, and I scanned the faces, suits, dresses, polished smiles, until I spotted him near a fountain, surrounded by a knot of men in tailored jackets. He was laughing, his head thrown back, the picture of a groom enjoying his day. I started toward him, weaving through the crowd, when a security guard stepped into my path, his hand raised like a stop sign. "Sir, I need to see your invitation," he said, his voice flat, his eyes sizing me up. I met his gaze, calm but firm. "I'm here at the groom's request. He called me yesterday. Check with him if you need to." The guard frowned, his hand hovering near his earpiece, ready to call for backup. I didn't flinch. I'd dealt with gatekeepers before, the kind who thought a suit couldn't hide a nobody. But before he could say anything, a voice cut through the chatter, loud and warm. "Chris? Is that Chris Ridley?" I looked past the guard and saw him, the groom, breaking away from his group, his face lighting up like we'd known each other for years. The guard froze, his hand dropping, and I gave him a nod before stepping forward. The groom crossed the courtyard in quick strides, his grin wide, oblivious to the heads turning around us. "Man, you made it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old buddies. "I was starting to think you'd ditch me." I smiled, keeping it easy, though my pulse kicked up a notch. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, my voice steady despite the eyes now locked on us. He turned to the crowd, his arm still on my shoulder, and raised his voice. "Everyone, listen up. This is Chris Ridley, the real genius behind CR Dynamics. The man who rebuilt my company from the inside out." A ripple went through the courtyard, murmurs spreading like wind through grass. I felt the shift, the way people stood a little straighter, their glances sharpening with curiosity. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, something stirred, pride, maybe, or relief that the truth was finally stepping into the light. I'd spent years in the background, fixing things without fanfare, letting my co-director take the spotlight while I worked in the shadows. But now, here I was, being called out by the man whose empire I'd saved, and it felt like slipping into a coat that fit just right. He kept talking, his voice carrying over the crowd, telling them how CR Dynamics had turned his company around, tripled efficiency, saved jobs, the whole story. I nodded along, letting him have his moment, but my eyes scanned the faces around us. Some were smiling, others whispering, and a few looked outright stunned, like they couldn't square the guy in front of them with the story they'd heard. I wondered if my wife was out here somewhere, watching this unfold, or if her sister had seen me yet. Part of me wanted to look for them, to catch their reactions, but I kept my focus on the groom, on the men now stepping closer, their hands extended for introductions. One of them, a gray-haired guy with a politician's smile, gripped my hand and said, "Heard about your work. Impressive stuff. You ever think about consulting for the state?" I thanked him, keeping my answer short, because this wasn't about selling myself. It was about being seen for what I'd already done. The groom waved over a waiter, pressing a glass of champagne into my hand, and I took it, though I wasn't much for drinking. "To new partnerships," he said, raising his own glass, and the men around us echoed the toast, their voices blending into a chorus. I sipped the champagne, the bubble sharp on my tongue, and let the moment settle. This was what I'd come for, not the praise, but the acknowledgement, the chance to stand in my own truth without anyone's permission. I glanced around again, the courtyard buzzing now, people moving closer like moss to a flame. A woman in a silver dress asked me about CR Dynamics, her questions sharp and practiced, like she was fishing for a deal. I answered politely, steering the conversation back to neutral ground, because I wasn't here to pitch. I was here to be present, to let the work speak for itself. The groom clapped me on the back again, pulling me toward another group, introducing me as the guy who saved my ass when the board was ready to jump ship. I laughed, the sound looser than I expected, and for a moment, it felt good, natural, like I could breathe in this space without looking over my shoulder. But then I caught a glimpse of movement near the cathedral doors, a flash of white that made me pause. I didn't turn, didn't let my eyes linger, because I didn't need to confirm it. I knew her sister was out there, probably watching, her perfect day tilting off its axis. I wondered what she'd do when she realized who I was, not the nobody she'd banned, but the man her fiancé was parading around like a hero. I took another sip of champagne, the glass cool against my palm, and pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about me, about stepping into a room I'd been told I didn't belong in and proving otherwise, not with words, but with the weight of what I'd built. The groom was still talking, his voice animated, pulling me into a story about some boardroom drama I'd only half heard at the time. I nodded, keeping up, but part of me was taking it all in, the laughter, the clink of glasses, the way the sunlight caught the fountain spray. This was a world I'd never cared to join, but standing here now, I realized I didn't have to. I wasn't chasing their approval or their lifestyle. I was just done letting them erase me. The crowd shifted again, more people pressing in, their questions piling up about my process, my firm, my plans for the future. I answered as best I could, keeping my voice steady, my words simple, because I didn't need to impress them. I'd already done the work, and that was enough. The groom leaned in, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "I'm glad you're here, man. This means a lot." I met his eyes and saw something genuine there, something that made me glad I'd come. "Happy to be here," I said, and I meant it, not for the crowd or the toasts, but for the chance to stand tall in a moment that was mine. I stood there in the courtyard, the groom's hand still on my shoulder, his voice ringing out as he told the crowd about the work I'd done for his company, and I felt the air shift, like the moment before a storm breaks. The murmurs around us grew louder, faces turning, eyes narrowing as people tried to piece together who I was. I kept my smile steady, the champagne glass cool in my hand, but my senses were sharp, picking up every glance, every whisper. I'd come here to answer the groom's invitation, to step into the truth of my work, but now that I was standing in it, I could feel the ground trembling under me, not with fear, but with something else, something alive. I scanned the crowd, catching glimpses of men nodding in approval, women leaning in to hear more, and then I saw her, my wife's sister, emerging from the cathedral doors, her white dress trailing behind her like a flag of surrender she didn't know she'd raised. She was arm in arm with the groom, her smile bright but fragile, like glass about to crack. Then her eyes landed on me, and that smile vanished, her face going pale as if the blood had drained right out of her. I held her gaze for a moment, not with anger, but with a quiet calm I hadn't expected to feel. She froze, her arms slipping from the groom's as she took a step forward, her bouquet clutched tight like it might anchor her. My wife appeared behind her, her expression a mix of dread and something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or resignation. I didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there as the groom kept talking, oblivious to the shift in his fiancée's demeanor. "This guy," he said, gesturing to me, his voice carrying over the courtyard. "He's the real owner of CR Dynamics. Not just some consultant. He's the one who saw what we needed when we were drowning. I can't believe I get to introduce him to all of you today." The words hit like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading through the crowd. I heard gasps, a few hushed no ways, and saw heads turning toward my wife's sister, whose eyes were now wide with something close to panic. She took another step, her heels clicking on the stone, and her voice came out sharp, cutting through the groom's speech. "Wait, you're that Chris?" I nodded, slow and deliberate, letting the moment stretch. "The same one you didn't want here," I said, my tone even, not cruel, just clear. "Guess I clean up okay." A murmur ran through the crowd, louder now, and I saw people leaning closer to each other, whispering, their eyes darting between me and her. The groom frowned, his hand dropping from my shoulder as he looked at her, then back at me, confusion creasing his brow. "Hold on," he said, his voice quieter now, like he was piecing it together. "You two know each other?" I didn't answer right away, letting her squirm in the silence. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her bouquet trembling in her hands. I could have let it hang, could have watched her try to talk her way out, but I wasn't here to twist the knife. "I'm married to her sister," I said, nodding toward my wife, who was standing a few feet away, her face pale, her hands clasped tight in front of her. "Didn't make the guest list, though? Seems there was a mix-up about who I am." The groom's eyes widened, his jaw tightening as he turned to his fiancée. "You banned him? The guy who saved my company." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the crowd go quiet, every ear straining to catch what came next. She stammered, her cheeks flushing red. "I didn't know. I thought he was just—" She cut herself off, realizing there was no safe way to finish that sentence. I took a sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp against my tongue, and let her words hang there, unfinished. I didn't need to fill in the blanks. Everyone else was doing it for me. I saw my wife step closer, her eyes on the ground, like she wanted to disappear. Part of me wanted to look at her, to see if she'd say something, stand up for me now that the truth was out, but I kept my focus on the groom. He was staring at his fiancée, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder, like he was seeing her for the first time. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," I said, my voice steady, not accusing, just laying it bare. Nobody did. The courtyard felt smaller now, the crowd pressing in, their whispers buzzing like static. I caught snippets, my name, the company's name, words like mechanic and genius tangled together. I stood tall, my suit fitting like armor, and let it all wash over me. I'd spent years dodging the spotlight, letting my co-director take the credit while I fixed things in the background. But now the light was on me, and I wasn't going to shrink from it. The groom shook his head, his laugh short and bitter. "This is unreal," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "I'm sorry, man. I had no idea." I shrugged, keeping it light, though my chest was tight. "Not your fault," I said. "You invited me. That's why I'm here." He nodded, something like respect flickering in his expression, and I felt a weight lift, not all of it, but enough to breathe a little easier. I glanced at my wife's sister again, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment, her bouquet sagging in her hands. She looked smaller now, her white dress less like a crown and more like a costume that didn't fit. I didn't feel sorry for her, not exactly, but I didn't feel triumphant either. This wasn't about tearing her down. It was about standing up, about letting the truth do the talking. My wife finally moved, stepping beside her sister, her hand hovering like she wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I didn't know what she wanted. For me to stop, to leave, to make it all go away. I didn't have that power, and even if I did, I wouldn't use it. I'd come here because I was asked, because the work I'd done mattered, and I wasn't going to apologize for that. The groom clapped a hand on my arm, pulling my attention back. "Come on," he said, his voice steadier now. "Let me introduce you to some people who've been dying to meet you." I nodded, following him toward a group of men in suits, their faces bright with interest. I could still feel her eyes on me, my wife's, her sister's, but I didn't look back. I'd said what I needed to say, stood where I needed to stand. The courtyard buzzed around me, the music starting up again, and I moved forward, one step at a time, into a moment that was finally mine. I followed the groom through the courtyard, his hand guiding me toward a cluster of men in crisp suits, their faces lit with the kind of curiosity that comes when someone's name carries weight. The air was warm, the scent of flowers mixing with the faint tang of champagne, but my focus was sharp, like the edge of a freshly turned wrench. I could still feel the eyes on me, some from the crowd, some heavier, like my wife's and her sister's, but I didn't turn around. I'd said my piece, let the truth step into the light, and now I was moving forward, one steady step at a time. The groom introduced me to his group, board members and investors, their handshakes firm, their questions quick and pointed. They wanted to know about CR dynamics, about how I'd turn their company around, about what I could do next. I answered simply, sticking to the facts, streamlined systems, better workflows, numbers that spoke louder than I ever could. They nodded, impressed, one of them scribbling a note on his phone, saying he'd call me next week. I smiled, polite but guarded, because this wasn't about chasing deals. It was about being seen, about standing in a space I'd been told I didn't belong. The whispers around us grew, a low hum that followed me like a shadow. People were talking, not just about my work, but about what had just happened, the way my wife's sister had gone pale when she realized who I was. I caught fragments of it, my name, her name, words like banned and embarrassed floating through the crowd. I didn't lean into it, didn't try to catch more. I'd come here to answer the groom's call, not to stir up drama, but the truth has a way of making waves whether you mean it to or not. I took a sip of champagne, the glass still in my hand, and let the conversation flow around me. The groom was animated, telling a story about how his company's stock had climbed after my fixes, and I nodded along, half listening, my mind drifting to the weight of the moment. I'd spent years keeping my head down, fixing things without fanfare, letting my co-director soak up the spotlight while I worked in the background. But now, standing here with these men hanging on my words, I felt something shift inside me, not pride, exactly, but a quiet strength, like a machine finally running at full power. I glanced across the courtyard, my eyes catching movement near the cathedral doors. My wife's sister was gone, probably off licking her wounds, but my wife was still there, standing with her parents, her face tight with something I couldn't name. Her father stepped forward, his shoulders hunched, and I braced myself as he approached, his wife trailing behind. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes meeting mine, and for the first time in years, he didn't look at me like I was beneath him. "We didn't know," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. About your company, about what you did for him. We had no idea. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray, buying a moment to steady myself. I'd waited a long time to hear something like that, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like I'd imagined. There was no triumph, no rush of vindication, just a tired ache, like a bruise I'd carried too long. You never asked, I said, not sharp, just honest. None of you did. He flinched, just enough to notice, and his wife touched his arm, her eyes darting away like she couldn't handle the weight of my words. I didn't push it, didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was enough. I turned back to the groom, who was watching the exchange with a frown, like he was starting to see the cracks in the family he'd almost married into. My wife stepped closer, her hands clasped tight in front of her, and I felt her presence like a pull I couldn't ignore. She didn't speak, didn't try to smooth things over, and I was glad for it. I wasn't ready for her words, not yet, not after she'd let her sister's band stand without a fight. I met her eyes for a moment, saw the shame there, the regret, but I didn't soften. She'd made her choice, and I was making mine, standing here, not as her husband, but as the man I'd always been. The groom clapped me on the back, pulling me back into the conversation, and I let myself ease into it, answering questions, shaking hands. The crowd was alive now, buzzing with energy, and I felt it carry me, like a current I didn't have to fight. A woman in a sharp blazer asked about my process, her eyes bright with interest, and I explained it in simple terms: find the problem, strip it down, build it back stronger. She nodded, impressed, and I realized I was enjoying this, not the attention, but the chance to talk about the work I loved, to let it breathe in a room full of people who actually listened. The music shifted, a string quartet starting up somewhere nearby, and I felt the day stretching out, full of possibilities I hadn't come here expecting. I wasn't naive. I knew this moment wouldn't fix everything, wouldn't erase the years of slights or the silence from my wife. But it was a start, a step towards something I could build on, like a foundation laid solid and true. The groom leaned in, his voice low. You're the real deal, man. I'm glad you're here. I nodded, meeting his eyes, and saw something like gratitude there, not just for the work, but for showing up, for standing tall when it would have been easier to stay home. Glad to be here, I said, and I meant it, not for the crowd or the handshakes, but for the chance to be myself, unapologetic and whole. I glanced at my wife again, still standing with her parents, her face softer now, like she was trying to find a way back to me. I didn't know if she could, didn't know if I wanted her to, not yet. But I felt her watching, felt the weight of her regret, and it didn't cut like it had before. I'd come here to reclaim my name, not to settle scores, and I'd done that. The rest? Her family, whatever came next, could wait. I turned back to the group, the conversation picking up again, and let myself sink into it, the questions, the laughter, the clink of glasses. The courtyard glowed under the afternoon sun, the world sharp and clear, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not hiding, not apologizing, just standing in the truth of who I was, letting it carry me forward. I stood in the courtyard, the weight of the groom's words still ringing in my ears, his introduction of me as the man who saved his company echoing through the crowd like a bell that wouldn't stop. The music had faltered, the string quartet missing a beat as the whispers grew louder, and I felt the air thicken with tension, like a storm was rolling in. My wife's sister was nowhere in sight. She'd vanished after her face went white, probably hiding somewhere to salvage what was left of her pride. My wife lingered near her parents, her eyes darting between me and the cathedral doors, like she was waiting for the ground to crack open and swallow this whole mess. I didn't look at her long, couldn't, not yet. I'd come here to answer the groom's call, to stand in the truth of my work, and I'd done that. But now, with the crowd buzzing and the wedding teetering, I realized the truth wasn't just a light, it was a spark, and sparks can burn. The groom was still by my side, his expression shifting from pride to unease as he glanced around, sensing the chaos creeping in. He tried to steer things back, clapping his hands and calling for everyone to head inside for the ceremony, but his voice lacked the easy confidence it had before. People moved slowly, their eyes still on me, on him, on the empty space where his fiancé should have been. I set my empty champagne glass on a table, the clink sharp in my ears, and took a breath, steadying myself. I hadn't meant to derail the day, not like this, but I wasn't going to apologize for showing up, either. I started toward the cathedral, following the crowd, when I heard her voice behind me, sharp and raw. Why would you do this? I turned and saw my wife's sister, her dress crumpled at the hem, her eyes red like she'd been crying. She stood alone, her bouquet gone, her hands clenched into fists. The crowd slowed, heads turning, and I felt their stares like a weight I didn't ask for. I kept my voice calm, low, not wanting to fuel the fire. I didn't come to ruin anything, I said, meeting her eyes. I came because he asked me to be here. I came because the truth shows up when it's ready. Her jaw tightened, and she took a step closer, her voice shaking. This was supposed to be my day, my moment. And you turned it into this. I didn't flinch, didn't look away. I'd spent years swallowing her family's judgment, letting their slights roll off me, but I was done bending. You made it this, I said, not cruel, just clear. You decided who I was before you even knew me. That's on you. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but the groom stepped between us, his face hard now, like he'd heard enough. That's enough, he said, his voice low but firm, aimed at her. This is your sister's husband. You should have known better. The words landed like a punch, and I saw her flinch, her eyes darting to him, then away, like she couldn't bear the truth in his gaze. The crowd was quiet now, the music gone, and I felt the moment stretch, heavy and fragile. I didn't add anything, didn't need to. The groom turned to me, his expression softer but strained. I'm sorry, man. This isn't what I wanted. I nodded, keeping it simple. Not your fault, I said, because it wasn't. He'd invited me here for the right reasons, and I'd come for mine. What happened after wasn't on us. It was on her, on the lies she'd built to keep me out. He gave me a tight nod and started toward the cathedral, gesturing for the crowd to follow, but the energy was off, like a machine grinding to a halt. People shuffled inside, their whispers trailing behind, and I stayed where I was, letting them pass. My wife appeared at my side, her hand brushing my arm, but I didn't look at her. Can we talk? She asked, her voice small, almost lost in the hum of the crowd. I shook my head, not sharp, just tired. Not now, I said, and kept my eyes on the cathedral doors, where the groom had disappeared. She didn't push, just stood there for a moment before slipping away, her footsteps fading into the noise. I didn't know what I'd say to her later, didn't know if there was anything left to say. She'd let her sister ban me, let her family's judgment stand, and that was a crack I wasn't sure we could mend. I started walking, not toward the cathedral but away, toward the edge of the courtyard, needing air, needing space. The chaos followed me, the murmurs, the glances, but I kept my head up, my steps steady. I'd done what I came to do, stood where I belonged, and I wasn't going to shrink now. An hour later, word spread that the ceremony wasn't happening. Not yet, maybe not at all. I overheard a waiter saying the groom had called it off, that he'd walked out after a fight behind closed doors. I didn't know the details, didn't need to. I could guess what broke it, her obsession with status, her need to control the story, the way she'd pushed away anyone who didn't fit her picture. I'd seen it in her eyes when she realized who I was, the panic of a world slipping out of her grip. I didn't feel sorry for her, but I didn't feel victorious either. I just felt done, like I'd carried a weight too long and finally set it down. I found a bench under a tree, the shade cool against my skin, and sat, letting the day settle around me. The courtyard was quieter now, the crowd thinning as people drifted to their cars, their voices low with gossip. I leaned back, my suit jacket creasing, and thought about what came next. I'd go home tonight, face my wife, maybe talk, maybe not. I didn't know if we could fix what was broken, didn't know if I wanted to try. But I knew one thing, I wasn't the man her family thought I was, and I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. I pulled out my phone, checking the time, and saw a text from my co-director at CR Dynamics. Heard you made waves. Proud of you. I smiled, just a little, and tucked the phone away. The sun was lower now, the light softer, and I felt the world slow, like an engine idling after a long run. I'd come here to stand in my truth, not to burn anything down, but sometimes truth is enough to change everything. I got up, brushing off my jacket, and started toward the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my shoes. Whatever happened next, her sister's fallout, my wife's apologies, the gossip that'd follow, I'd face it on my terms, not theirs. I wasn't hiding anymore, and that was enough for now. I drove home from the wedding with the windows down, the night air rushing in, cool and sharp against my skin, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain. My wife sat beside me, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes fixed on the dashboard like it might tell her what to say. The radio was off, the hum of the engine the only sound, and I let the silence stretch, heavy but not unbearable. I'd left the wedding after the chaos settled, after the groom called it off and my wife's sister locked herself away, her dream of a perfect day crumbling in front of everyone. I didn't stay to watch the fallout, didn't need to. I'd gone there to stand in my truth, to answer the groom's invitation, and I'd done that. Now, driving through the dark, I felt the weight of it all easing, like a knot slowly coming undone. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my suit jacket folded in the back seat, the tie loosened around my neck. The road stretched out ahead, lined with street lights that flickered like they were keeping secrets, and I wondered what came next, not just tonight, but tomorrow, the day after, the rest of my life. I glanced at my wife, her profile soft in the dim glow, and saw the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers twisted together. She hadn't spoken since we left, hadn't tried to explain or apologize, and I wasn't sure I wanted her to, not yet. I turned my eyes back to the road, focusing on the white lines, the rhythm of driving, because it was easier than untangling the mess between us. We pulled into the driveway, the house dark except for the porch light I'd left on, and I cut the engine, the silence settling in thicker now. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and she followed, her heels clicking soft against the pavement. Inside, I flipped on the kitchen light, the fluorescent hum filling the quiet, and poured myself a glass of water, the cold biting my palm. She stood by the counter, her purse still clutched like a shield, and finally spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her eyes on the floor, like she couldn't face me. I got tired of fighting them, of always defending you." I took a sip of water, letting her words hang there, the glass cool against my lips. I'd waited for her to say something like this, to acknowledge the gap between us, but hearing it didn't feel like I thought it would. There was no relief, no anger, just a dull ache, like a bruise I'd stopped noticing until it was pressed. I set the glass down, the clink sharp in the quiet, and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "You didn't defend me," I said, not harsh, just clear. "You let them decide who I was. You stood behind them, not beside me." Her eyes flicked up, glistening now, and I saw the guilt there, raw and heavy. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like the words were stuck, and I didn't push her to find them. I was tired of carrying her family's judgment, tired of waiting for her to see me the way I'd always seen her. I turned and headed for the living room, needing space, needing to breathe. The couch creaked as I sat, the familiar sag of it grounding me, and I stared at the blank TV, my reflection faint in the screen. I thought about the wedding, about the way the crowd had looked at me, not as the guy in greasy overalls, but as the man who'd saved an empire. It felt good, standing in that light, but it didn't erase the years of being invisible to the people who should have known better. My wife followed me, hovering in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floor. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice stronger now, like she was trying to mean it. "I should have fought for you. I see that now." I nodded, slow and deliberate, but didn't answer right away. Sorry was a start, but it wasn't a fix, not for the silence she'd chosen, not for the way she'd let her sister's words stand unchallenged. I leaned back, my hands resting on my knees, and thought about the life we'd built. The house, the memories, the quiet nights like this one, when it was just us and the world felt small. I'd loved her through all of it, through her family's slights and my own doubts. But love wasn't enough if it only went one way. "I need time," I said finally, my voice steady, not cold, just honest. "I need to figure out what this means for us." Her breath caught, a small sound, and I saw her nod out of the corner of my eye, her hands twisting together again. She didn't argue, didn't try to fix it with more words, and I was glad for that. She turned and slipped upstairs, her footsteps fading, and I stayed where I was, the house settling around me, creaking like it was exhaling. I thought about the wedding again, about the groom's face when he realized what his fiancé had done, about the way her sister had crumbled when her world tipped over. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd built that trap herself, snaring her own future with her need to look bigger than she was. But I didn't feel triumphant either. I'd gone there to be seen, not to tear anyone down, and I'd done what I set out to do. The rest was hers to carry. I stood, stretching my shoulders, and walked to the window, the night pressing against the glass. The street was quiet, the neighbor's dog barking faintly, and I felt the world slow, like it was giving me room to think. I'd move out next week. I decided, not forever, maybe, but for now. I needed space to sort through this, to see if I could rebuild something with my wife or if that bridge was too far gone. I didn't know the answer, didn't need to know it tonight. For now, it was enough to know I'd stood tall, that I'd walked into a room I was told to stay out of and left with my head high. I turned off the light and headed upstairs, the stairs creaking under my weight. The bedroom was dark, my wife already in bed, her breathing soft but uneven, like she was fighting sleep. I didn't climb in beside her, not tonight. I grabbed a blanket from the closet and settled on the couch, the fabric rough against my skin. I closed my eyes, the day replaying in flashes, the courtyard, the groom's voice, my wife's silence, and let it fade, piece by piece. Tomorrow was a new day, a new chance to fix what was broken, starting with myself. I leaned over the engine of a beat-up sedan, the familiar scent of oil and metal wrapping around me like an old friend, my hands moving steady as I tightened a bolt at Ridge Auto Works. It had been a year since that wedding, a year since I walked into a courtyard I'd been banned from and let the truth do the talking. The shop was busier now, the bays full most days, my assistant hustling in the back while the phone rang with new jobs. I wiped my hands on a rag, the grease smearing across my knuckles, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in, not just for the work, but for the life I'd kept building, piece by piece, no matter what anyone thought of me. The morning sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust in the air, and I stepped back to check my progress, the engine humming smooth now, ready for the road. I'd always loved this part, taking something broken and making it whole again. Cars were easier than people, but I'd learned to live with that. I thought about the past year as I grabbed a coffee from the pod in the corner, the bitter warmth waking me up. CR Dynamics, my consulting firm, had grown faster than I'd expected. 6 major clients now, big firms with deep pockets, all wanting the kind of fixes I'd pulled off for the groom's company. I still stayed out of the spotlight, letting my co-director handle the meetings and press, but word had spread, and my name carried weight in rooms I'd never stepped foot in. I took a sip, leaning against my workbench, and let that sink in. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. My wife's family, her sister, all the people who'd looked past me. It was about knowing my own worth, about building something solid, grease and all. The door chimed, and I glanced up, expecting a customer, but it was just a delivery guy dropping off a box of parts. I signed for it, my pen scratching the clipboard, and thought about the groom. We'd stayed in touch, not close, but enough to trade emails now and then. He'd moved on, married someone else a few months back, a quiet woman who didn't care about status, who laughed at his bad jokes and stood by him without needing to control the story. I'd sent a card, nothing fancy, just a note wishing them well. He'd written back, thanking me, saying he'd learned a lot from that day, from seeing how I'd handled it. I didn't know if he meant the work or the way I'd stood my ground, but it didn't matter. I was glad he'd found his way. I set the box down, the tools inside clanking, and my mind drifted to my wife's sister. She'd faded from the headlines, but not from the gossip, at least, not in this town. People still talked about her, not as the socialite who almost married a millionaire, but as the woman who'd banned one from her wedding. I'd heard she'd moved out of state, chasing a fresh start, but I didn't know if it was true, and I didn't care enough to ask. Her life was hers to fix, same as mine was mine. I walked over to my desk, the clutter of invoices and catalogs a comforting mess, and checked my schedule. A couple of oil changes, a brake job, nothing I couldn't handle. The shop was my anchor, the place where I could lose myself in the work, where nobody could tell me I didn't belong. I thought about my wife, about the messages she sent now and then, short, careful, like she was testing the water. I answered them, polite but brief, because I wasn't ready for more. I'd moved out a week after the wedding, renting a small place across town, just me and a couch that creaked too much. It wasn't home, not really, but it was enough. A space to think, to figure out who I was without her shadow or her family's judgment. I hadn't filed for divorce, hadn't closed that door, but I hadn't opened it either. Some things take time, and I was okay with that. I grabbed a wrench and headed back to the sedan, the rhythm of work pulling me in. As I tightened a hose clamp, I heard footsteps behind me, light but deliberate, and turned to see a man in a clean button-up, his eyes scanning the shop like he was sizing it up. "You Chris Ridley?" he asked, his voice friendly but curious. I nodded, wiping my hands on the rag again. "That's me," I said, keeping it simple. He smiled, stepping closer, and held out his hand. "Heard about you. The guy who fixes cars and companies. Thought I'd see the place for myself." I shook his hand, my grip firm, and saw the spark in his eyes. Another client, maybe, or just someone chasing the story. I'd gotten used to it, the way people showed up now, their questions half about the work and half about that day. I didn't mind, not anymore. I gave him a quick tour, pointing out the bays, the tools, the Mustang I was still restoring in the corner, its curves gleaming under the lights. He asked about CR dynamics, about how I juggled it with the shop, and I answered straight, long hours, good people, a lot of coffee. He laughed, nodding like he got it, and I felt the ease of it, the way I could talk about my world without needing to prove anything. When he left, promising to call about a job, I stood in the doorway, the sun warm on my face, and watched his car pull away. The street was quiet, the day stretching out, and I felt something settle inside me, not peace, not yet, but close. I'd spent a year rebuilding, not just cars or companies, but myself, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. I didn't need my wife's family to see me, didn't need their apologies or their approval. I'd walked into their world and walked out taller, and that was enough. I went back inside, the shop humming around me, and picked up my wrench again, the weight of it familiar, grounding. A customer pulled in, their engine rattling like a warning, and I waved them over, ready to get to work. "You're that Chris Ridley?" they said as they stepped out, their eyes wide with recognition. I smiled, just a little, and shrugged. "Still just a mechanic," I said, tossing the rag over my shoulder. "With a little extra horsepower." They laughed, and I got to it, sliding under their car, the world narrowing to the task in front of me. I didn't know what the future held, with my wife, with her family, with the clients piling up, but I knew I'd face it on my terms, with grease on my hands and my head high. The shop was my kingdom, my work my truth, and as long as I had that, I'd keep moving forward, one fix at a time, building something nobody could take away.